Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good morning, everybody. Good evening for Dr. Weber. Selamat pagi semuanya. Good morning. Today we will have a very good sessions, very good scientific meetings, and we have very good speaker. Now the first one is Dr. Muhammad Yamin, and the second one is Dr. Usman Beber from Texas, US. Today we will run the scientific meetings with the scientific meeting with titles "How to Optimize the Benefit of Potent Antiplatelet Therapy for Post-PCI Patient in SCS and CCS." And the first speaker will be held by Dr. Muhammad Yamin, spesialis jantung pembuluh darah, konsultan FSCAE VH. We will have the topics potent antiplatelet for post-PCI patients. What does the latest guidelines say? And the second speakers will be with Usman Beber, MD/MS, with topics tailoring strategy of the APT duration to optimize the benefits of potent antiplatelet in SCS and CCS. Now I will introduce our first speaker, Dr. Muhammad Yamin, SPJP, konsultan FACC, FSCAE VH, is a staff of cardiology department at Cipto Mangunkusumo General Hospital. His education, medical doctor from University Syekh Kuala and cardiologist from University of Indonesia, and got PhD in medical science also from University of Indonesia. And he has a lot of fellowships from Japan, Malaysia, double fellowship, electrophysiologist and pacing, and interventional cardiologist. And now he is staff of cardiology department at Cipto Mangunkusumo General Hospital. Please, Dr. Yamin, you can start your sessions with the title is Potent Antiplatelet for Post-PCI Patient. How does the latest guideline says? Please, time is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Eka. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi. My special greeting goes to Dr. Weber from US, who has provided his time, his expertise for us to join our meeting today. So without any ado, I would like to start my presentation. Saya akan mulai in Indonesian, Dr. Weber, but anyway, all my slides are in English. So at this opportunity, pada kesempatan ini saya mengucapkan terima kasih kepada panitia, the committee, and then also our partner today, yaitu AstraZeneca. Let me share my slide. Saya share slide saya, Dr. Eka, ya. So hari ini saya akan menyampaikan tentang bagaimana pemakaian antiplatelet, terutama yang poten, pada pasien-pasien yang telah menjalani PCI. Jadi PCI itulah percutaneous coronary intervention atau PTCA stent, dan yang kita akan bahas adalah bagaimana guideline atau pedoman tata laksana terkini. Actually, my talk is only a preliminary, is a take off. The next speaker, Dr. Weber, will do all the cruising of this, the details cruising of the antiplatelets until the landing. So my talk is actually, my duty is very light compared to Dr. Weber. Okay, so this is my disclaimer. This is the outline of my talk today. Ini adalah outline-nya. Pertama saya akan memberikan introduksi, kemudian ada kasus, kemudian saya akan menyampaikan guideline, bagaimana guideline terkini soal pemakaian antiplatelet, kemudian ringkasan. Nah, kita ketahui bahwa para sejawat sekalian, para peserta, dual antiplatelet terapi atau pemakaian antiplatelet ganda itu sudah menjadi, katakanlah, pedoman utama dan sudah menjadi praktek kita sehari-hari, ya. Yang pertama, yang tertua adalah aspirin, kemudian P2Y12 receptor inhibitor, ya, ADP receptor inhibitor. Nah, pemakaian dan pemilihan serta lamanya DAPT ini kita gunakan itu banyak tergantung pada banyak faktor. Faktor klinis, kemudian tentu faktor risiko perdarahan dan risiko iskemik pada setiap pasien. Nah, adanya perbedaan wilayah, geografi dan regional ya seperti barat, timur dan etnis, Asia dan Caucasian itu tentu akan menjadikan pertimbangan kita. Tidak semerta-merta semua guideline itu bisa kita aplikasikan ke etnis Asia atau ke daerah kita ya. Kemudian tentu kita sadari bahwa tidak mungkin semua guideline itu atau semua guideline itu akan cocok untuk semua pasien. Kita harus melakukan tailor approach based on individual patient characteristic. Itu penting juga. Nah, saya kasih contoh kasus ya. Ini kasus pertama adalah seorang wanita 75 tahun datang dengan chronic coronary syndrome. Jadi chronic coronary syndrome itu nama lamanya dulu angina pectoris stabil. Faktor risikonya hipertensi, dislipidemia, tidak ada riwayat perdarahan, fungsi ginjalnya bagus, fungsi ventrikel kirinya dari echo bagus. Nah, ini kalau kita lihat hasil angiografinya ya, kita lihat suatu lesi yang panjang, long CTO, jadi chronic total occlusive RCA dari dari tengahnya sampai ke sini itu total buntu. Nah, kemudian kita lakukan tindakan ya, dan kita berhasil membuka vessel ini dan kita pasang kira-kira 4 stent di sini dari proksimal sampai ke distal. Nah, kasus kedua ini seorang laki-laki umur 50 tahun datang dengan acute coronary syndrome STEMI inferior dengan faktor risiko merokok dan type 2 diabetes. Dia mengalami kelainan ginjal, ada chronic kidney disease, GFR 45, kemudian fungsi liver bagus. Fungsi sistolik pada ventrikel kiri juga bagus. Nah, ini EKG-nya kita lihat jelas sekali ya, para sejawat sekalian, ada ST elevasi di 2-3 FEF. Nah, ini koronernya saat dilakukan angiografi, kita lihat terdapat total oklusi di proksimal, ya. Kemudian berhasil dilakukan leversolarisasi dengan pemasangan 1 stent, ya, jadi terjadi proses yang maksimal pada pasien ini. Nah, setelah kita mendapatkan 2 kasus ini, tentu ada pertanyaan dalam diri kita. Kira-kira saya akan memakai double antiplatelet yang mana nih untuk masing-masing pasien tadi? Apakah yang biasa atau yang poten? Ya. Kemudian berapa lama? Nah, kemudian kalau terjadi side effects, apa yang harus kita perhatikan? Apakah kita bisa melakukan penggantian atau switching? Nah, para sejawat sekalian, pada kesempatan ini saya akan melakukan resume atau pembahasan berdasarkan 2 guideline utama, yaitu guideline tentang pemakaian antiplatelet dari SC tahun 2017, kemudian guideline SC tahun 2020 tentang non-STEMI, lalu yang kita adopsi adalah tahun 2019 tentang STEMI. Tetapi jangan lupa, seperti saya katakan di depan tadi, bahwa kita memiliki karakteristik etnis dan regional yang berbeda antara barat dan timur ya. Nah, kenapa kita pilih guideline Eropa ini? Kita memilihnya tentu alasannya ada ya. Kita pakai karena biasanya guideline dari Eropa ini simple, gampang ya, mudah dimengerti dan singkat. Kemudian banyak guideline nasional kita juga mengadopsi dari SC. Nah, tentu jangan lupa seperti saya katakan tadi bahwa ada perbedaan etnis, Asian, non-Asian, kemudian regional, Western, and East. Maka itu akan membuat kita harus melakukan adopsi atau konsensus baru untuk mengakomodasi perbedaan tadi. Oleh karena itu, alasan kita bahwa kita harus juga mengadopsi guideline lokal, minimal regional, se-Asia Pasifik, itu karena adanya variasi di AVT di antara Asia. Jadi pemakaian di AVT di kalangan Asia juga berbeda-beda. Kemudian adanya angka polimorfisme yang cukup signifikan di ras Asia. Dan yang harus diingat adalah bahwa populasi Asia dalam trial-trial besar seperti Plato, ya, kemudian trial obat-obat antiplatelet yang baru ini tidak banyak. Jadi tidak terwakili dengan baik. Oleh karena itu kita harus melakukan modifikasi. Nah, para sejawat sekalian, saya sedikit menyinggung soal sejarah pemakaian antiplatelet. Kita tahu bahwa pemakaian antiplatelet di dunia kedokteran, terutama pada penyakit jantung koroner itu sudah dimulai cukup lama, sekitar tahun 90-an, tahun 60-an ya, atau tahun 90-an trialnya, yaitu dimulai dengan pemakaian aspirin. Jadi yang paling lama itu aspirin, ticobidin, kemudian clopidogrel. Nah, clopidogrel pernah menjadi idola beberapa lama ya, kemudian tapi kita tahu bahwa belakangan ini ya kita itu sekitar tahun 2006-an atau tahun 2006 ke atas 2009 muncul obat antiplatelet yang baru yang kita sebut dengan newer P2 wild type inhibitor atau dengan lainnya potent antiplatelet, yaitu diwakili oleh golongan pasugrel dan 3-gerol. Jadi banyak trial yang sudah dikerjakan untuk 2 obat ini. Nah, bagaimana cara kerjanya? Kalau kita lihat secara sekilas di sini bahwa kita tahu antiplatelet itu kalau aspirin dia memblok di level tromboksan A2. Sedangkan ADP reseptor itu diblok oleh clopidogrel, pasugrel, dan ticagrelor. Nah, kalau dalam pasien-pasien dengan penyakit jantung koroner umumnya diperlukan pemakaian double antiplatelet, apakah itu CCS atau ACS, terutama yang telah menjalani PCI. Nah, pemakaian aspirin digabung dengan ADP receptor inhibitor inilah yang kita kenal dengan double antiplatelet. Nah, kita tahu tadi saya sudah sebutkan ada aspirin sebagai antiplatelet yang paling lama, kemudian ada clopidogrel, ada tiopiridin. Nah, kita ingat sekarang ada 2 atau ada 3 ya golongan baru yang kita sebut dengan newer P2 Y12 inhibitor atau potent antiplatelet, yaitu pasugrel, ticagrelor, dan cangrelor. Pada kesempatan ini kita akan fokus membahas ticagrelor. Nah, para sejawat sekalian, kalau kita lihat secara karakteristik farmakodinamik dan farmakokinetik obat ini, ya seumumnya cara kerjanya sama, itu memblok ADP receptor inhibitor. Cuma kalau kita lihat ticagrelor, keunggulannya adalah dia adalah reversible, kemudian sifatnya bukan prodrug. Karena dia bukan prodrug, ya langsung zat aktif saat diabsorpsi, maka keunggulannya tidak akan terpengaruh oleh mekanisme metabolisme di liver. Sedangkan yang lain kira-kira hampir sama saya kira karakteristiknya. Nah, yang perlu kita ingat para sejawat sekalian adalah setiap kita memberikan obat antiplatelet kah atau antitrombotik kah, kita harus melakukan penyeimbangan. Jadi tantangannya adalah melakukan keseimbangan antara trombosis atau mencegah trombosis atau resiko perdarahan. Nah, biasanya keseimbangan itu harus kita dapat dengan 2 cara ini tadi ya. Kita lihat karakteristik pasiennya. Jadi ini yang tidak mudah saya kira ya, menimbang-nimbang antara risiko berdarah dengan risiko perdarahan. Tetap dengan risiko trombosis. Maaf. Tetapi untuk hal antiplatelet, kalau kita tahu bahwa kalau antikoagulan kita punya namanya CHA2DS score, kita punya Hesberg score. Untuk antiplatelet ternyata kita juga punya beberapa kriteria atau faktor, katakanlah skor yang bisa kita pakai untuk menilai apakah seorang pasien itu berisiko tinggi untuk terjadi perdarahan atau risiko tinggi terhadap ischemic event. Nah, kalau kita lihat salah satunya adalah precise DAVT score. Nah, precise DAVT score ini kita pakai pada saat pasien menjalani dari mulai pertama menjalani coronary stenting atau PCI. Nah, ada 2 pertimbangan. Apakah kita akan memakai short DAVT yaitu 3-6 bulan atau long DAVT 12-24 bulan. Apa pertimbangannya? Nah, ada score calculation-nya, ada hitungannya ya. Hitungan itu didasarkan pada hemoglobin, kadar white blood count, kemudian usia, creatinine clearance, fungsi ginjal, apakah ada riwayat perdarahan sebelumnya. Nah, itu dimuat dalam satu skor. Misalnya pasiennya HB-nya katakanlah 10 ya, maka kalau kita tarik 14. Kemudian pernah creatinine clearance-nya cuma 40, 14 tambah berapa ini? Tarik 15 itu udah 28. Nah, kalau dia di atas 25, kita menyebutnya high risk. Oleh karena itu, maka DAPT-nya kita perpendek 3 atau 6 bulan. Tetapi kalau dia skornya di bawah 25, maka kita bisa memakai DAPT yang standar sampai 12 bulan atau kita perpanjang. Kenapa harus kita perpanjang? Nanti ada kriterianya lagi ya. Nah, tetapi setelah 12 bulan pasiennya mendapatkan antiplatelet tanpa kejadian yang bermakna dalam arti risiko perdarahan, ini dia ya setelah 12 bulan, nah kita bisa pertimbangkan apakah kita mau perpanjang sampai 3 bulan atau cukup 12 bulan saja. Nah itu ada lagi skornya. Kita hitung berdasarkan usia, 75, 65, 75, di bawah 65, apakah merokok, diabetes, apakah ada MI atau ada MI sebelumnya atau ada riwayat PCI ataukah memakai obat paclitaxel routing stent atau stentnya pendek nggak sampai dari 3 mili ya 3 cm saya kira mungkin maksudnya ya. Kemudian adakah heart failure atau vein graft atau tidak. Nah itu juga nanti dikategorikan dalam skor yang tinggi atau rendah. Kalau skornya lebih dari 2 maka kita harus memberikan long DAPT. Karena apa? Karena kita anggap bahwa pasien dengan karakteristik ini adalah pasien yang berisiko untuk ischemic event. Nah, jadi ada 2 pertimbangan saat dikerjakan sampai 12 bulan atau 24 bulan, kemudian setelah dikerjakan. Nah, kita akan bahas berikutnya adalah 2 skenario penyakit jantung koroner, yaitu chronic coronary syndrome dan acute coronary syndrome. Kita tahu bahwa chronic coronary syndrome itu terbagi dalam 3 rentang spektrum yang luas, ya, mulai dari pasien datang dengan gejala angina yang khas, atau bisa juga datang dengan heart failure, atau datang dengan ACS, atau bahkan pasien yang asimptomatik. Ya. Jadi datangnya itu kebetulan saja check up, kemudian ditemukan ada CAD. Jadi rentang ACS itu cukup luas sekali, jadi tergantung kemampuan kita, kejelian kita, dan modalitas kita untuk melakukan diagnostik. Kita bisa menangkap pasien ini dalam spektrum yang paling kiri, sampai yang tidak ada gejala. Nah, para jawab sekalian, perjalanan klinis pasien-pasien CCA dengan chronic coronary syndrome ini cukup variatif ya. Kita bisa menemukan pasiennya pada saat awal sekali ya. Jadi kira-kira dia datang ya sebelum 12 bulan, ya sudah pasiennya datang dalam keadaan sudah terjadi katakanlah simptom, kita diagnostik, kita revaskularisasi. Nah, kalau pasien ini kita pelihara dengan baik ya, kita lakukan modifikasi lifestyle, obat yang maksimal, kemudian terapi yang optimal, maka kita lihat risikonya akan rendah. Namun kalau pasien yang telat, dia didiagnostik pada saat ini, pada saat ACS, jadi pasiennya sudah mulai ada katakanlah aterosklerosis, CCS yang tidak terdiagnostik, tiba-tiba datang dengan ACS, acute coronary syndrome. Nah, kemudian kita lakukan PCI. Nah, 12 bulan pasca ACS ini pasiennya biasanya mengalami risiko untuk terjadi ischemic event atau thrombolik event yang cukup tinggi. Bisa terjadi ACS berulang, revaskularisasi, dan 12 bulan pasca ACS bisa terjadi lagi. Apalagi kalau pasiennya high risk, misalnya DM, ya, multivessel disease, elderly, gangguan ginjal, merokok, kemudian tidak menjalani modifikasi tidak menjalani lifestyle modification yang baik. Nah, itu akan mendapatkan risiko yang tinggi untuk terjadinya cardiac event, MI atau MIS. Nah, saat kita mendapatkan pasien dengan CCS, ya, apakah gejalanya tipikal angina, maka kita harus melakukan diagnostik. Nah, diagnostik itu kita bisa lakukan dengan berbagai modalitas, ya, bisa dengan treadmill test, bisa dengan DSE, dopamine score, perfusion scan, atau cardiac MRI. Nah, kalau kita membuktikan terdapat iskemi yang signifikan, multivessel disease, misalnya di sebelah kiri ini, nah, kita baru melakukan nanti assessment fungsional, ya. Ini memang terlalu spesifik, ya. Ini terlalu technical. Kita lakukan FFR assessment kalau dia di bawah 0,8 signifikan ada iskemik, kita lakukan revaskularisasi. Demikian juga kalau pasiennya iskemiknya tidak terkompensasi dengan baik, tapi terdapat diameter stenosis yang besar, kita FR juga. Kalau FR-nya rendah, maka kita harus lakukan intervensi. Di sisi kanan juga demikian, saya kira ya. Kalau dokumentasi iskemiknya besar, dengan PET scan misalnya, lebih dari 10%, kita harus lakukan revaskularisasi. Ini saya kira modalitas diagnostik, semua pasien CCS, kita pastikan apakah iskemik burden-nya cukup besar untuk dilakukan revaskularisasi. Nah, para sejawat sekalian, seandainya pasien tadi yang CCS kasus kita yang pertama tadi, ibu-ibu tadi menjalani PCI atau pemasangan stent seperti kasus yang kita jelaskan tadi, maka kita lihat bahwa kalau dia setelah menjalani stent dan irama sinus, kenapa irama sinus ditekankan? Nanti kalau pasien atrial fibrillasi lain lagi ya, itu manajemennya dengan antikoagulan ada sesi khusus, saya kira tidak cukup waktu kita bahas semuanya. Nah, jadi intinya memang betul bahwa pasca CCS, obat yang terpilih untuk antiplatelet itu ya masih aspirin. Kemudian Clopidogrel itu kita boleh loading sampai 600 mg ya. Tidak perlu loading kalau pasiennya sudah dapat rutin 5 hari sebelumnya. Nah, kemudian dilanjutkan 6 bulan. Nanti kita assess lagi ya, kalau ischemic risk-nya tinggi kita boleh perpanjang seperti yang katakan di depan. Mungkin nanti Dr. Beber juga akan menjelaskan ya. Nah, kemudian kalau seandainya pasien saat dipasang seperti pasien saya tadi, stennya 4, kemudian risk thrombosis, left main itu di cabang utama kompleks ya, rotablator ya, gagal ginjal segala macam. Nah, kita diberi kesempatan nih untuk memberikan antiplatelet yang poten, yang kuat tadi, yang 2 jenis tadi, apakah Pasugrel atau Ticagrelor. Ini untuk geren Eropa ya. Kita pertimbangkan. Tentu syaratnya tidak ada kontraindikasi ya. Nah, sekarang kita lihat kasus yang tadi yang pertama. Kan tadi pertanyaan mau pakai yang mana ini kira-kira. Nah, kalau kita lihat tadi pasiennya dengan multiple stents ya, ada 4 stent itu long stent, pasiennya elderly, hypertension misalnya ya. Nah, maka saya kira pada pasien ini saya kira berdasarkan pengumuman tadi tidak ada salahnya kalau tidak ada kontraindikasi kita memilih antiplatelet yang poten ya. Nah, kemudian subset berikutnya adalah STEMI. Jadi pasien-pasien dengan atherosclerotic coronary artery disease tadi bisa datang dengan STEMI. STEMI tentu seperti kasus kedua yang saya jelaskan tadi. Nah, kita lihat di sini bahwa pilihan pertama pada STEMI untuk antiplateletnya nih ya, itu kita harus dianjurkan pada keadaan Eropa nih, kita harus pakai yang poten, yang baru tadi, yaitu Pasugrel atau Ticagrelor. Kita boleh mengganti Clopidogrel kalau ada kontraindikasi. Sebenarnya di Indonesia alhamdulillah ya, Ticagrelor ini masuk dalam formalium nasional. Jadi di awal National Health Coverage System dia covered. Jadi sebenarnya tidak ada isunya, mungkin tinggal pengalaman dan kebiasaan dan keberanian kita. Dan itu dipertahankan sampai 12 bulan, kecuali ada kontraindikasi, ada risiko bleeding. Tadi sudah ada kan yang kita sebut dengan predict score tadi yang di depan sudah saya jelaskan. Nah, kalau kita ambil kasus kedua tadi ya, trombosis, ini STEMI inferior, and then pasang stent, nah, saya kira ini pasien ini sangat memenuhi syarat untuk kita mulai dengan terapi dengan potent double antiplatelet based on the ESC guideline. Nah, bagaimana kalau pasiennya mendapat terapi fibrinolysis, jadi tidak di PCI? Kita tahu kan tidak semua rumah sakit bisa melakukan PCI, atau kalau sejawat ada rumah sakit tipe B, tipe C, kasih trombolitik dulu deh, atau kalau mau dikirim juga terlalu lambat, better to give fibrinolysis prior to PCI misalnya, oke kasih fibrinolysis. Nah, apa yang kita lakukan? Nah, setelah kita berikan fibrinolysis, pasien tentu diberikan antiplateletnya aspirin dan clopidogrel. Tetapi kita ingat di sini ada catatan, setelah dia mendapatkan fibrinolysis ya atau 48 jam misalnya, kita bisa switch ke yang poten tadi. Tentu dengan mempertimbangkan kalau pasiennya akan menjalani PCI. Tidak ada masalah, jadi switch ya. Mungkin nanti Dr. Weber akan menjelaskan. Nah, bagaimana dengan Asia Pacific Society of Cardiology Guideline? Kalau kita lihat sebenarnya hampir sama. Jadi kalau pasien-pasien dengan STEMI ya dan umumnya menjalani tindakan primary PCI atau intervensi primer, maka kita bisa memberikan regimen aspirin and ini dia first choice kata guideline ini adalah ticagrelol atau pasugrel. Second choice clopidogrel. They don't give any reason why second choice should be available. I think because of the availability atau contraindication ya. And then boleh nggak switching? Boleh. Kalau pasiennya dikasih trombolitik seperti tadi guideline-nya Eropa, boleh di switch ya. Di switch ke ticagrelol atau paling tidak di delay sampai 8 jam atau sampai besok. Ini menurut dari guideline Asia Pasifik, konsensus Asia Pasifik, kemudian diteruskan sampai 12 bulan. Nah, para steward sekalian, setting berikutnya adalah non-STEMI atau non-ST elevation acute chronic syndrome. Bagaimana di sini? Nah, kalau kita lihat, non-STEMI ini juga punya dua alur ya. Kalau pasiennya datang di rumah sakit yang PCI capable atau yang bisa PCI, RSCM, Harapan Kita, Gatot Subroto atau rumah sakit lain banyak sekarang yang bisa ya. Nah, kita tentu nilai kalau pasiennya high risk, ya di within 2 hours kita harus lakukan PCI, invasive strategy. Ya. Apa itu high risk? Shock, hemodinamik, VTVF, ya, ongoing chest pain, life-threatening arrhythmia, itu masuk dalam high risk. Nah, kalau rumah sakitnya tidak bisa melakukan PCI, kita assess. Kalau dia very high risk, terpaksa dirujuk. Nah, kalau dia high risk, bisa dirujuk pada hari yang sama. Kalau very high risk, dalam secepatnya. Kalau dia low risk, kita bisa lakukan select invasive. Mungkin dalam 72 jam baru kita lakukan PCI. Nah, bagaimana pemilihan antitrombotik pada non-STEMI? Nah, pada non-STEMI tergantung karakteristik pasien gitu ya. Jadi ada 3 faktor. Faktor pasien, faktor prosedur, dan faktor co-medication, obat-obat lain yang diminum oleh pasien ya. Jadi kalau pasiennya misalnya usianya tua, fragile atau frail, tentu kita memilih antiplatelet yang tidak terlalu berisiko untuk high bleeding. Kita sudah punya skornya tadi. Kemudian apakah ada riwayat berdarah sama, itu tentu yang akan menentukan apakah kita akan memilih yang poten atau tidak. Kemudian clinical presentation, CCS atau ACS. Yang ACS itu umumnya high thrombotic possibility. High thrombogenicity-nya tinggi. Ya, jadi kita biasanya akan memberikan yang poten dan agak lama dibandingkan yang CCS. Kita lihat tadi yang CCS boleh sampai 6 bulan kan, tapi kalau yang ACS rata-rata sampai 12 bulan, malah bisa diperpanjang kalau prosedurnya kompleks atau ada faktor-faktor komorbid yang memperberat risiko atau mempertinggi risiko. Misalnya CKD, diabetes, PAD, heart failure. Kemudian obat-obatan. Nah, ini penting juga. Kalau pasiennya makan obat yang lain seperti antikoagulan karena atrial fibrillation, maka pertimbangan menjadi beda lagi. Ini satu sesi khusus ya, nggak cukup kita bahas di sini. Nah, kemudian aspek prosedur ya. Kita harus pertimbangkan. Kalau dia high risk bleeding, we use radial approach ya. Kemudian apakah invasi atau non invasi semua akan dipertimbangkan. Nah, tentu ini semua menjadi pertimbangan kita untuk memilih regimen yang terbaik, yang tepat untuk antitrombotiknya. Keseimbangan harus dicapai antara ischemic and bleeding ya. It's difficult but challenging. Nah, seperti saya katakan tadi, antitrombotiknya yang kita pakai hampir sama ya. Kita bisa pilih. Nah, ini salah satu kriteria untuk pasien apakah dia ini dari Academic Research Consortium High Bleeding Risk ya. Itu dia membagi kriteria lagi. untuk pasien-pasien yang mendapat antitrombotik tadi pada ACS ya pada non-STEMI. Jadi kalau yang major risk itu kalau kita dapat satu ya, misalnya pasiennya akan dapat oral antikoagulan yang panjang, misalnya ganti katup, mechanical valve atau permanent AF dengan charge fast tinggi ya, CKD segala macam. Ini kalau kita temu satu, ini pasiennya itu high risk untuk bleeding. Nah, kalau di kanan itu yang minor risk. Ini kita pertimbangkan juga kalau kita nanti memberikan antitrombotik pada pasien-pasien ACS. Nah, yang paling penting adalah kita lihat di sini bahwa pada pasien-pasien non-STEMI ACS ini, ticagrelor itu diberikan ya, apakah dia akan invasif atau konservatif. Jadi apakah akan di PCI segera di bawah 2 jam seperti kata tadi yang high risk, atau nanti di dalam 72 jam karena dia low risk tetap diberikan 180 loading kemudian 90. Nah, kalau kita lihat clopidogrel masih ada tempatnya kalau nggak ada atau kalau kontraindikasi. Tapi dengan masuknya dalam promarium nasional, saya kira nggak ada alasan ya kita tidak bisa memilih ini, karena toh di cover oleh sistem kita, mungkin berdasarkan data-data yang kuat tadi. Nah, para sahabat sekalian, nah ini dia dilihatkan bahwa Pasugrel bisa juga diberikan lebih disukai daripada ticagrelor pada non-STEMI yang pasiennya langsung menjalani PCI, tapi yang dua-duanya bisa sebenarnya ya. Nah, sekarang soal durasi. Tadi mungkin Dr. Beber Dr. Beber will touch about this issue as well, bahwa sepanjang ini yang kita tahu bahwa akan diperpanjang sampai 12 bulan standarnya kalau pasca non-STEMI. Nanti apakah akan diprolong? Tadi saya sudah katakan, kita nimbang-nimbang iskemik dan bleeding risk-nya. Nah, kemudian di sini kelas 2A disebutkan bahwa pemanjangan pemberian antitrombotik ini tentu akan harus dinilai dengan bagaimana risiko iskemik dan risiko perdarahan. Tidak mudah, tapi saya kira ada pedoman yang bisa kita pakai tadi IRC, HbR score ada, kemudian predict score, DAPT score, semuanya bisa kita pakai. Nah, ini para sejawat sekalian, mana-mana keadaan yang kita kategorikan sebagai high thrombotic risk, jadi yang iskemik risk-nya tinggi, gampang mampet lagi, gampang trombosis lagi. Nah, kalau kita lihat di sini, pertama ya ini komorbid ya, diabetes, kemudian pernah MI, multivessel disease, pasien-pasien kita tadi yang saya jelaskan semuanya multivessel tuh ya. Kemudian dapat serangan jantungnya di usia muda, baru 45 tahun kurang, atau CKD ya mulai dari stage 2 juga kena ini ya. Kemudian kalau dipasang 3 stent minimal. Nah, pasien saya tadi tuh yang pertama 4 stent saya pasang. Ya kan? Panjangnya lebih dari 60 mili pastilah ya. Nah, itu termasuk yang high risk thrombotic risk atau high thrombotic risk. Jadi dia kalau kita pasang, kalau kita kasihnya pas-pasan dan antiplateletnya tidak optimal, tidak poten, gampang trombosis lagi, bisa STEMI lagi ya. Nah, ini seperti saya katakan tadi, pemilihan apakah kita akan perpanjang atau tidak harus dipertimbangkan precise DAPT score, di depan sudah dijelaskan, dan ARC HbR kriteria. Gampang sekali kita hafal tadi ya. Kemudian kita harus perhatikan juga kalau dia mendapatkan DAPT, kemudian kita bisa stop aspirin 3-6 bulan ya, tergantung dari pertimbangan-pertimbangan tadi kalau memang harus diperlukan. Nah, para sejawat sekalian, dalam summary ini, dalam ringkasan alur tata laksana ini, kita lihat bahwa kalau pasiennya non-STEMI, udah pasti ya kita kasih salah satu dari antikoagulan di atas ini, bisa unfrenesed heparin, enoxaparin, atau bivaluridin. Kemudian kita lihat bleeding risk. Kalau bleeding risk-nya low, kita lihat apakah iskemiknya risk-nya tinggi. Kalau iskemik risk-nya tinggi, ini kita bisa memperpanjang double antiplatelet setelah tadi mendapatkan aspirin atau prasugrel atau ticagrelor atau clopidogrel sampai lebih dari 12 bulan dengan aspirin pasugrel atau aspirin dengan ticagrelor. Ya bisa lebih dari 12 bulan, tergantung tadi keseimbangan antara iskemik risk dengan thrombotic risk atau bleeding risk. Ini dia ya. Gitu-gitu kira-kira. Jadi jangan lupa memperhatikan itu. Nah, para sejawat sekalian, bagaimana dengan guideline dari Asia Pasifik? Saya kira hampir sama ya. Kalau guideline Asia Pasifik juga kita lihat kalau pasiennya non-STEMI kemudian sudah dalam aspirin ya, kemudian kita pertimbangkan, kan tadi sudah saya sebutkan ya, bisa PCI, bisa tidak, tergantung dari apakah high risk atau low risk. Nah, kita boleh memberikan ticagrelor atau clopidogrel, pilihannya terserah ya, tapi pasugrel tidak direkomendasikan kalau di Asia Pasifik. Nah, kalau kita menjalani atau pasiennya menjalani early angiography procedure, jadi early invasive kan high risk ya, harus segera dilakukan PCI, maka first choice ticagrel di sini kalau Asia Pasifik. Second line-nya baru Fasudrel, third choice-nya baru Clopidogrel. Bukan berarti Clopidogrel nggak boleh, tapi ketiga. Jadi istri ketiga dia, istri pertamanya ticagrel. Nah, kemudian baru kita lihat apakah kita lihat bagaimana pola antiplatelet terapinya, apakah bisa kalau aspirin seumur hidup, kemudian masih bisa diberhentikan ticagrel atau Clopidogrel 5 hari atau pas juga 7 hari kalau pasiennya menjalani CABG. Kadang-kadang pasiennya kan kita lakukan infarct related revascularization aja, infarct related artery revascularization, kemudian yang sisanya CABG kita boleh stop kalau pasiennya harus operasi. Nah, para sejawat sekalian, moderator yang saya hormati, sampailah kita pada ringkasan bahwa di APT memang diperlukan ya dalam setting ACS atau CCS. Tapi kita ingat bahwa ada DAPT yang kuat sekarang, yaitu ticagrelor dan fasudrel yang bisa menjadi pilihan kita, terutama pada ACS nih, karena ACS itu high thrombogenic risk-nya cukup besar. Nah, kemudian pada pasien-pasien dengan CCS, maka kita lihat bahwa yang poten ini masih bisa kita pilihkan ya pada pasien-pasien yang high risk. Tadi seperti saya katakan, stand-nya panjang, diabetes, CKD, tua, ya, kemudian sudah pernah MI, pernah stroke, itu kan high risk pasien. Nah, kemudian soal berapa lama, mau pendek, short, standar, prolong, itu harus dipertimbangkan antara bleeding risk dengan ischemic risk. Ada patokannya. Nah, kalau pasiennya ischemic risk-nya lebih besar dari bleeding risk-nya, kita boleh mempertimbangkan untuk memperpanjang antiplatelet lebih dari setahun. Tentu harus diingat bahwa pendekatan ini tidak ada yang one size fit for all, nggak ada. We have to tailor based on the individual patient. Dengan itu saya akhiri presentasi saya. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you for your attention. Terima kasih.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Pantai Lampung Acehnya itu luar biasa, Dr. Yamin.
my hometown, Eka.
Ya, oke. Someday we will go there. Oke, Dr. Yamin sudah menyampaikan tentang bagaimana pentingnya antiplatelet pada pasien-pasien post PCI, beberapa pilihan, dan kunci poinnya adalah tailoring ya, Dr. Yamin ya. Bagaimana strategi supaya DAPT ini bisa optimal dilakukan pada pasien-pasien ACS dan CCS. Dan ini akan masuk materi oleh Dr. Usman Bebar. So we will continue with second speaker with topic tailoring strategy of DAPT durations to optimize the benefit of potent antiplatelet in ACS and CCS. Our speaker is Dr. Usman Bebar, MD, MS. Dr. Usman Bebar, I will introduce him first. His education is from B.A. Rice University, Houston, and also MD from University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center, Dallas, Texas, and then from Columbia University Medical Center with work experience as Associate Professor Cardiovascular at University of Oklahoma Health Science Centers, and he is also now Director Cardiac Catheterization Lab, University of Oklahoma Health Science Centers. Dr. Usman Bebar, please, your time is yours. Dr. Usman, you can unmute your speaker. You can unmute.
Oh, there we go.
All right.
Okay. Sorry about that. So first, Dr. Yamin, Dr. Eka, Assalamu alaikum. It is truly a pleasure and an honor to be invited to this conference to speak with all of you. And certainly, I hope in the not too distant future to be able to come visit you in person and speak with you. So Dr. Yamin has given us a very nice overview of some of the guidelines, many of the salient points. And what I'm going to do is kind of continue the conversation and really try to focus on some of the evidence that has evolved over the last few years when we try to make these very difficult decisions about lowering bleeding without compromising ischemic efficacy in our patients we see in the cath lab. And these are my disclosures. So I will start off with a case presentation of a patient I took care of that highlights many of the relevant points that we'll be bringing up that have already been brought up and I will be speaking about explicitly. So this is a patient who's 75 years old. Like many patients we see nowadays, she has a history of cancer. Thankfully, the cancer is no longer active. She has some other comorbidities, lung disease, peripheral arterial disease, diabetes. You can see the BMI is quite low, certainly for a United States patient. Hemoglobin is right at 11, normal kidney function, and she now presents with the non-ST elevation MI. This is the angiogram, and you can see this is her left anterior descending artery, and there's a clear culprit lesion right here in the mid-LAD. So in this patient, from a technical standpoint, it's really not much of a challenge. We can take care of this lesion. Really, the question that is highlighted by this patient presentation is how do we quantify or think about this patient's risk for subsequent bleeding and ischemic events, and then how will that inform our decision with respect to DAPT duration? Should we do 1, 3, 6, or longer? And what do you do chronically? After you take care of this patient in the acute phase, how do you go on and protect them in the more chronic phase? So with that, my outline for the talk is I'll touch on some of the basis for why we even give DAPT after PCI or ACS. We'll talk about the concepts of how we think about bleeding risk, and then I'll focus really on 3 bleeding reduction strategies that are in the literature. First being shortening the duration of dual antiplatelet therapy. Second, withdrawal of aspirin. Third, de-escalation, all of which have been studied and examined. And then finally, some points on our current guidelines. So with that, I think it's important to start off with the foundation of why is it that we even give 2 drugs, dual antiplatelet therapy? Where does that come from? Where did that lesson originate? Well, it turns out it was 20 years ago in the CURE trial, and at this time it was unclear if patients would benefit if we add a second drug on top of aspirin. So in this landmark trial, the CURE trial, which included almost 13,000 patients with non-ST ACS, there was a comparison of clopidogrel to placebo on a background of aspirin. So it's not that long ago, it's only 20 years ago when it was still unknown if you should even add anything to aspirin in patients with an acute coronary syndrome. The results, as we all know, clearly showed us that the patients who received both clopidogrel and aspirin did much better with respect to a composite endpoint of MI, stroke, or CV death. There was a 20% reduction in relative risk. And whenever I talk about the CURE trial, I always mention there are 2 important lessons that we learned from this trial. The first lesson is that certainly 2 drugs are better than 1 when we want to prevent recurrent atherothrombotic events in ACS patients. In other words, DAPT, this is where DAPT really originated. And second, we must treat patients for at least 1 year. Look at the CURE trial, this was the duration of therapy, and it is why to this day we still are fulfilling that same dogma and that same paradigm to treat patients for at least 1 year after an ACS event. Now, there is a challenge with clopidogrel, and that challenge is highlighted by this slide. And in particular, what this slide illustrates is that when you administer clopidogrel to patients, and then you test the blood for responsiveness to that drug, you find quite a bit of variability. And certainly when we are administering a drug and we want a good therapeutic response, we don't want so much variability. And certainly this variability is driven by many factors. Patient-related factors such as age, BMI, and renal disease, but also genetic factors, which are particularly important in East Asian patients who have more polymorphisms that render patients less responsive to clopidogrel. And therefore, because of this significant variability, we have other drugs. The first drug, of course, being prasugrel, as shown here. And prasugrel is certainly more potent than clopidogrel. You can see on the left, the degree of platelet inhibition achieved with prasugrel is much higher than it is with clopidogrel, and it has a more durable effect, as you can see on the right. And this drug was tested in a clinical trial, the Triton-TIMI 38 trial, as illustrated here. And in this trial, about 14,000 patients were enrolled, all with ACS, all undergoing PCI. And here you have a comparison of prasugrel versus clopidogrel on a background of aspirin. And not surprisingly, given the profile of prasugrel being a more potent agent, we see a benefit with respect, again, to CV death, MI, and stroke, about a 20% relative reduction, as you can see here. But there is a biological paradigm. Anytime we lower thrombotic events, we must pay some kind of penalty, and that penalty, of course, comes in the form of bleeding. And in the Triton TIMI 38 trial, we certainly saw excess risk of major and life-threatening bleeding. And very importantly, there was an increase in intracranial hemorrhage in patients with a prior stroke or TIA. And that is why, to this day, there is a black box warning, and you really cannot administer prasugrel in patients who really have a history of cerebrovascular disease, particularly prior stroke or TIA. Well, we have a second drug, that being, of course, ticagrelor. And again, this is a pharmacodynamic study that illustrates the effect of ticagrelor in the orange as compared with clopidogrel in the green. And what you can once again see is ticagrelor is very potent. It achieves much higher levels of platelet inhibition. And secondly, you will notice that the onset of action of ticagrelor is quite rapid. In fact, in the first 30 minutes, you were achieving almost full antiplatelet effect. And of course, this is particularly relevant in our patients with an acute MI when we want to get rapid levels of platelet inhibition in a very short time period. And the relevant trial for ticagrelor was, of course, the Plato trial, which compared in almost 20,000 patients with acute coronary syndrome, ticagrelor versus clopidogrel on the background of aspirin. And again, similar to what we have seen in both the CURE and the Triton trial, we see that ticagrelor significantly reduced by about 16% the risk for CV death, MI, and stroke. So two different drugs, both ticagrelor and prasugrel, both beating clopidogrel, but once again, there is going to be a penalty. And the penalty, again, with ticagrelor comes in the form of bleeding, as illustrated here on the left. Importantly, though, fatal bleeding was not significantly higher in this trial when we compared ticagrelor to clopidogrel. And then with these trials, we have our most recent iteration of our guidelines in 2016, which give a class 1 indication for at least 1 year of DAPT for patients who present with an MI. Important to note, it doesn't matter how you treat the patient. Medical therapy, lytics, intervention, or bypass surgery, they all get 1 year of therapy. And then you can go beyond 12 months if bleeding risk is not high. When we look at, as Dr. Yamin has already mentioned, there is clearly a preference for ticagrelor over clopidogrel, and there is a preference for prasugrel over clopidogrel as well, but there's always this caveat that only in patients who are not at high risk for bleeding. So that kind of sets sort of our stage for why we administer DAPT. We administer DAPT because it lowers thrombotic events compared to aspirin, why we want to use the more potent agents is compared with clopidogrel, but there's this penalty to be paid with respect to bleeding. Now, conventionally, traditionally, we thought of bleeding as only mattering if it caused death or if it was in the brain or intracranial. The reality is over the last 10 to 15 years, our appreciation for why bleeding matters has become much more nuanced. And what I mean by that is illustrated in this study by Eichelboom and colleagues. And what they did is they examined different levels of bleeding, as shown here, and the risk for mortality on over 6 months. Now, it is not surprising that if a patient has a life-threatening bleeding, meaning their blood pressure is dropping, they're bleeding in their brain, of course, those patients have a high risk of death. What was the important observation, it was that major bleeding has also an association with high risk of death. Patients who have a major bleed have about a 10% mortality rate over a 6-month period. And that was really the novel insight, that even if bleeding was not fatal, if it was some type of an event that maybe required a blood transfusion, required you to be hospitalized, and patients were okay after a couple of days, still those patients had a very high risk for death. Dr. Moran and colleagues further expanded our understanding of the relationship between bleeding and death in this study, where they examined the association between MI and major bleed and subsequent mortality. And what they showed specifically was that when a patient has a myocardial infarction, they have an early risk for death, but that risk for death goes down within a month. In contrast, when patients have a major bleed, they have an elevated risk for death, but that risk remains elevated over time. And therefore, from this observation, we learn that mortality risk after a bleed is even comparable to that of an MI. And therefore, we should prioritize reducing bleeding as much as we want to lower risk for atherothrombotic events. And I think that's an important concept that came through us to us in the literature from this study. The other reason bleeding is really relevant is because the patients we see in the cath lab who present with an acute MI have really changed over the last 20 to 30 years. And this study from the Mayo Clinic highlights this. And what they did here is they examined the type of death, namely cardiac death in the solid black and non-cardiac death in the dotted line in the early 1990s, then the late 90s, and then into the 2000s. And what you will notice is that the risk for cardiac death in the solid black was quite high in the early to mid 1990s, but now in the more contemporary eras, actually non-cardiac deaths are becoming more and more common. And I think anecdotally, we all realize this, the type of patients we take care of every day in the cath lab who present with an MI are very different than they were 10, 15, or 20 years ago. Nowadays, we see patients who are older, have underlying cancer, other comorbidities, and therefore it makes sense and it is rational that the toxicity or the penalty with respect to bleeding is higher now than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Now, despite this knowledge that we've gained, it was only 2 years ago that we finally got a standardized definition for what we even mean by high bleeding risk. As Dr. Yamin has already illustrated, this is called the High Bleeding Risk Academic Research Consortium, or HBR-ARC definition. And what this was an effort by a group of investigators, other stakeholders, regulatory entities, and they came together and they thought about what were the key factors that lead to high risk of bleeding, and those are all illustrated here. In addition, what this document did is it defined a threshold for us. So you are considered a high bleeding risk patient if you have an annual risk of major bleeding of at least 4%. And BARC 3 or 5 bleeding, these are significant bleeds. BARC 5 bleeding is fatal bleeding. BARC 3 bleeding is a type of bleeding that lands you in the hospital, requires surgery, blood transfusion. So this is quite a high level of bleeding and a high threshold to break. So really, we're talking about patients who have a substantial risk for bleeding over a 1-year time period. And these are the individual criteria that have already been shown. And essentially, you are considered high bleeding risk if you have 1 major criterion, as shown here on the left, or 2 minor criterion. So how common are these? How frequently do we encounter patients who are deemed high bleeding risk per these definitions? Well, several studies have been done to quantify this burden. These are data from the Burn PCI registry, where they examined over 12,000 patients undergoing PCI and looked at BARC 3 or 5 bleeding. And what they found in the orange is that 39% of the patients undergoing PCI in this all-comer registry would be considered high bleeding risk. And in fact, since this study has been published, there have been several others, and the percentages are about the same. So it looks like in contemporary clinical practice, anywhere from 30, 35 to about 40% of patients we see are actually considered high bleeding risk per the ARC HBR criteria. Well, what about East Asian patients? Certainly, this is a patient population that has not been adequately represented in our major trials that I've already gone through, the CURE trial, Triton, Plato, and others. And there is a concern not only for excess bleeding, but also genetic polymorphisms that may render these patients not responsive to clopidogrel. So what I've done here in this slide is simply look at several studies that have focused exclusively on East Asian patients, the PHILO study, the Tika Korea study, and the Asian subset from the Plato trial. And what I've just plotted here are the rates of major bleeding in each of these studies, and the black line represents the threshold set forth by the HBR group. And you can see that in general, I think it is true that when we talk about East Asian patients, and in these studies, these are predominantly patients from Korea or Japan, it is conceivable to say that most of these patients are indeed high bleeding risk just based on East Asian ethnicity. And therefore, identifying strategies that can lower bleeding risk is really paramount in such patients. And we will now focus on some of these bleeding reduction strategies, the first being shortening the duration of DAPT. Now, this makes a lot of sense. If you have a patient who truly is a high bleeding risk patient, someone in their 80s, someone who has kidney disease, someone who is on an oral anticoagulant, it makes sense that what we want to do is give them the least intense antiplatelet therapy as possible, meaning a less potent agent and meaning a short duration. And this approach has been studied now in several trials. The first trial that looked at this was the Leaders Free trial in 2,500 patients. And what was unique about the Leaders Free trial is they only studied patients deemed high bleeding risk. These are the kind of patients that we normally don't include in clinical studies. You can see here, 65% of the patients were over the age of 75, over 1/3 were on an oral anticoagulant, and so on and so forth. And in this trial, all patients got DAPT for only 1 month. So although these patients were presenting for PCI, almost 30% had an acute syndrome, all got DAPT for only 1 month. And what that meant for the majority was aspirin and clopidogrel, followed by aspirin alone. And you can see in the Leaders Free trial and in other trials similar to it, Zeus HBR and Onyx 1, the 1-year rates of bleeding, despite only receiving 1 month of DAPT, are well above that threshold of 4% set forth by the ARC HBR. Now, it's not surprising when you look at the types of patients that were included, mean age over 75 to 80 years old. So certainly one strategy that seems to be accepted and makes sense is that if we encounter this true HBR patients, perhaps giving a very short duration of DAPT may be reasonable, at least in some of these patients. The challenge, though, is that if you are a patient who is high bleeding risk, not only are you at risk for a future bleed, you are also at risk for a future ischemic event. That's illustrated in this slide from the Burn PCI group and many other groups. On the left, you can see that high bleeding risk patients, of course, have a higher risk for bleeding, BARC 3 or 5, but look at the right. Those exact same patients also have double the risk of ischemic events. So certainly giving just a short duration of DAPT might work for some patients, but how do you identify those patients who are HBR who might benefit from a different strategy? And to answer that question, Philippe Urban and colleagues developed a model exclusively focusing on the high bleeding risk patient. And what they did here is they looked at all of the different studies that have exclusively enrolled high bleeding risk patients, and they developed models to predict the risk for bleeding on the left and thrombotic events on the right. And what they found that there were some risk factors that uniquely predict the risk for bleeding. For example, if you give a patient oral anticoagulant, if you have liver disease, if you are advanced age, if you have COPD, these are parameters that exclusively predict risk for bleeding. MI or stent thrombosis was exclusively predicted by a history of prior MI, a troponin positive presentation, diabetes, and so on. Now, some factors were common to both events, such as having anemia or kidney disease, but the fact that there was some unique factors for bleeding and unique factors for MI or stent thrombosis implies that we might be able to differentiate those patients who will bleed from those patients who will have a subsequent heart attack. And that's exactly what they showed here on this graph. The x-axis represents the 1-year rates of bleeding from this data set. The y-axis represents the risk of thrombotic events. And what you can see in the shaded areas is there are some patients where the risk for thrombotic events is higher than bleeding. And conversely, there are other patients where the risk for bleeding is higher than thrombosis. And in fact, if you look at the numbers, you can see that about 25% or so patients are uniquely at elevated risk for bleeding, and about 45% are uniquely elevated risk for thrombosis. So certainly when we encounter the high bleeding risk patient, a strategy, and at least some, may be just to give a very short duration of DAPT and give aspirin alone. But even within the high bleeding risk subset, we can identify those patients who will have excess risk for thrombosis, in which case we might think of prolonging the duration of DAPT or perhaps even giving a more potent P2Y12 inhibitor. So what are some other strategies? And the one other strategy that's really been tested and examined quite a bit is withdrawal of aspirin. And the rationale of withdrawing aspirin is simply that if we get rid of aspirin, but we continue the P2Y12 inhibitor, we can still get the benefits of platelet inhibition and without the penalty of aspirin-related bleeding. This has now been studied in several trials, and this is a table illustrating those patients who had acute syndromes in all of the trials, Global Leaders, Twilight, TICO, and Smart Choice. You can see all of these trials used ticagrelor with the exception of Smart Choice, which looked at clopidogrel. In all of these trials, patients got 1 to 3 months of dual antiplatelet therapy. And I will point out the major bleeding rates in all of these trials were below the HBR threshold of 4%. So when we think about the application of this strategy, aspirin withdrawal, we must remind ourselves that this strategy has really been tested in populations where the 1-year rate of bleeding was under 4%. Nevertheless, the summary, the evidence base for aspirin withdrawal is quite profound. Over 30,000 randomized patients. Thus far, no evidence of harm upon aspirin withdrawal with variable reductions in bleeding, and certainly the benefits seem to be pronounced in patients with acute syndromes. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the trial I was involved in, the Twilight trial. And the reason for that is that Twilight had some unique design factors that I think set it apart from some of the other studies. One of those is that Twilight was a double-blinded, placebo-controlled trial. And secondly, in Twilight, we only included patients who had at least a clinical and an angiographic feature associated with the high risk of ischemic or bleeding events. So we designed this trial to really focus on patients who have at least are enriched with some type of ischemic or bleeding risk factors. And these are the criteria. On the left, you can see clinical criteria. On the right, you can see angiographic criteria. So to be enrolled in Twilight, a patient had to have at least one clinical criteria and at least one angiographic criteria. And in the Twilight study, this is the flow of what happened to the patients who had acute syndrome. So you can see we enrolled 9,000 patients. Out of them, a little over 4,600 were randomized who had underlying acute coronary syndromes. And you can see the breakdown of ticagrelor alone versus ticagrelor plus aspirin. What did the characteristics of these patients look like? Again, you can see here the average age is about 64. This is much younger than what we saw in the HBR trials where the average age was 75, 76. You can see there's a high prevalence of diabetes. And just to highlight some of these factors, the young age, high prevalence of diabetes, 25% with the prior MI. So you get a sense that the kind of patients being studied here seem to be more on the thrombotic side, enriched with thrombotic factors than bleeding factors. And when we look at some of the procedural details, you can see multivessel disease was quite common, and total stent length almost 40 millimeters. So certainly patients with ACS who also are enriched with other risk, with other factors, both clinical and angiographic, for subsequent thrombotic events. Here are the results. We found, again, in Twilight, all patients got 3 months of DAPT, and then one arm got ticagrelor alone. That's shown in the blue. And in red is the control arm that got ticagrelor plus aspirin. And you can see for the endpoint of bleeding, significant reduction of 4% absolute, 53% in relative. Now, that's not surprising. We should not be surprised that if you withdraw aspirin, you will get less bleeding. The important point from this trial and others like it is what happens on the ischemic side. If you get rid of aspirin, and remember, these are patients with acute coronary syndrome, the average stent length of 40 millimeters, 35% with diabetes. In these patients, and if you withdraw aspirin, are you going to have enough protection with ticagrelor to not have excess thrombotic risk? And that's exactly what we found. You can see the Kaplan-Meier curves are on top of one another. Hazard ratio 0.97, p-value 0.84, indicating that even in these patients with acute coronary syndrome, ticagrelor monotherapy is as good as ticagrelor plus aspirin. And to further explore this, we looked at our Twilight ACS population according to the number of risk factors they had. We had some patients with just 1, 2, or 3 risk factors on the left, others with 4 or 5, and then some patients here, about 15, 17%, who had multiple risk factors upon enrollment. And when we looked at those patients, we found that as the number of risk factors went up, the overall event rate of death and minor stroke goes up. You can see in patients with 6 or more risk factors, the 1-year rate of death and minor stroke was very high, 9%. Nevertheless, ticagrelor alone was as good as ticagrelor plus aspirin. You can see these point estimates and intervals are all across 1, no evidence of interaction, indicating that the strategy of ticagrelor alone, even in these very high thrombotic risk patients, seems to be plenty to prevent against ischemic events as compared with ticagrelor plus aspirin. Dr. Donahue and colleagues examined this in a meta-analysis showing on the left, and you can see the results from Twilight and other trials, all pretty comparable for bleeding. Again, not a surprise. If you get rid of aspirin, you will have less bleeding. The question is on the ischemic side, and you can see, in fact, the reduction in bleeding translates to about a 15% reduction in bleeding. And in this pooled analysis conducted by Dr. Valgimigli and colleagues, where they looked at 14,000 patients from Twilight and Global Leaders, they found that in the patients who got ticagrelor alone compared with dual antiplatelet therapy, there was even a reduction in mortality of about 30%. And to date, this is the only strategy looking at bleeding reduction that has any signal of a mortality benefit. So I think should really be considered in our patients where we want to lower bleeding and not pay a penalty with respect to ischemic events. Well, what about de-escalation? This is a strategy getting, I think, a lot of attention lately. This is something that I think often we have to do in practice if we have a patient and for some reason, cost or others, we have to switch them from a potent agent to clopidogrel. But many investigators have now examined de-escalation as an a priori strategy. And the idea of de-escalation is that thrombotic risk is highest early, bleeding risk tends to be more persistent over time, and therefore asks the question of whether or not the intensity of DAPT should match the natural variation in thrombotic and bleeding risk. And there are different ways we can go about with de-escalation. One way is that you can switch from a potent P2Y12 inhibitor, so you switch from ticagrelor, prasugrel to clopidogrel. Another way is you can reduce the dose of the potent P2Y12 inhibitor, so maybe you go from ticagrelor 90 to 60 or from prasugrel 10 to 5. You can de-escalate based upon genotype, platelet function testing, or unguided. And you can do this approach at the time of stenting or several weeks later. So you can imagine there are many different combinations that we can envision when we think about de-escalation. I'm going to go through one trial that has gotten, I think, a lot of press, the Talos AMI study that was presented at ACC in 2000, just this year. And what they did here is they looked at patients with acute MI. All patients got aspirin and ticagrelor for 30 days. And after 30 days, those patients who were doing well were randomized to aspirin plus clopidogrel versus aspirin plus ticagrelor. So this is an unguided de-escalation. All patients are getting aspirin plus clopidogrel, and the other arm is getting aspirin plus ticagrelor. The investigators assumed an event rate of about 9%, and they had a sample size of about 2,600 patients, so a reasonable patient population in terms of sample size. If you look at some of the characteristics of these patients, you will see the vast majority just had one vessel treated, the total stent length about 30 millimeters. So you can get a sense that in terms of some of the thrombotic risk factors, they were actually on the lower side. And when we look at the results, again, if we look at the bleeding results at the top, you see that the de-escalation group, where you went from ticagrelor to clopidogrel, had a reduction in bleeding. Again, that's not a surprise. We know already from Plato that clopidogrel will have less bleeding than ticagrelor. The question is, if you de-escalate in this manner, are you going to pay a penalty on the ischemic side? And here I would say that the results are very inconclusive. You can see, for example, the number of spontaneous MIs was only 23. Hazard ratio is very imprecise. Target vessel MI, only 15 events. Hazard ratio very imprecise. So I think an interesting study, important that it was done. It's not surprising you get less bleeding, but should we change our practice based on this number of events? I would say not. And so when we interpret this, I think we have to remind ourselves the cohort was quite low risk, event rates were lower than expected, and the estimates for ischemic events do not rule out the potential for actually harm with de-escalation. There's another very intriguing possibility when we think about de-escalation that is of particular relevance to East Asian patients, and that is dose reduction with ticagrelor. This is the Optima trial published by Park and colleagues and Jack in 2018. And what they did here is they looked at East Asian patients with acute coronary syndrome, 65 patients. They had 3 different arms. One arm was to give 120 milligram of ticagrelor followed by 60 BID. The other arm was 180 ticagrelor followed by 90 BID, and those are these here. And the control arm was 600 of clopidogrel followed by 75 daily, and the endpoint was platelet reactivity, and that's shown on the y-axis. So you can see that in this cohort of ACS East Asian patients, platelet reactivity with either 120 or 180 of clopidogrel went down nicely. And really, there was no difference between 120 and 180. And it suggests, perhaps, at least the author suggests, that maybe in East Asian patients, a lower dose of 60 milligrams may be a therapeutic option. In other words, you can still get enough platelet inhibition and perhaps get less bleeding. Now, this was a small study. It doesn't demonstrate that, but that strategy is being tested in an ongoing trial called a Taylor-CHIP trial, and we'll see what the results of that show. So finally, a couple of points on some of our guidelines. So when it comes to our stable patients, because of concerns about bleeding risk, we now say that you should only give 6 months of DAPT, primarily with aspirin and clopidogrel. The caveat, of course, is if you do have patients, perhaps multivessel stenting, very long stent length, you could consider a more potent agent, but the guidelines really make a clear preference for clopidogrel in stable patients. And the duration of DAPT really should be in patients who are not at high bleeding risk, you can go over 6 months, and in patients who are at high bleeding risk, to discontinue P2Y12 inhibitor after just 3 months. So this concept of bleeding risk is really embedded and infused throughout our clinical trials. And again, the 3 strategies I mentioned that I've gone through is what the most recent ESC guidelines say. So when you think about shortening antithrombotic treatment duration, we have 3 different approaches. First, give a short duration of DAPT, that's a 2A indication in patients at high bleeding risk. Second is stopping aspirin and continuing the P2Y12 inhibitor. I actually think it's stronger than 2A, but they give it a 2A. And then finally, this concept of de-escalation, which has shown some promise, and that gets a 2B indication. And finally, a proposed algorithm that Dr. Angelillo and myself kind of worked on to kind of put some of these concepts in place and what we suggest is that when you have a patient, the first thing really you need to do is figure out, are they a high bleeding risk? Do they fulfill the HBR criteria? And if they do, your default in the majority will probably be to give a month of DAPT followed by single antiplatelet therapy. Now, for the remaining patients who are not at high bleeding risk, you should then think about their ischemic risk. Are they at high ischemic risk, intermediate or high? Meaning, do they have ACS? Do they have other high-risk features, multiple stents, long stent length, diabetes, so on and so forth? In those patients, you could give 12 months of DAPT with the potent P2Y12 inhibitor, or based on what the TICO trial, Twilight, and others showed, give 1 to 3 months of DAPT followed by ticagrelor alone. For those patients who are not at high bleeding risk nor at high ischemic risk, you will probably be just fine giving a short duration of DAPT and aspirin alone, which is what our current guidelines recommend. So the final slide, our case resolution. Again, this was our 75-year-old female, several comorbidities, presents with a non-STEMI. And again, if you look at her, based on what we've just discussed, she has several criteria for high bleeding risk. She's age 75 and she has a hemoglobin of 11. So those are 2 criteria that do put her in the HBR criteria. However, she also has diabetes and she's presenting with a non-STEMI, so also has clear thrombotic criteria. We treated her with a single stent that was pretty easily done. And then the strategy that I adopted to treat her was a biodegradable drug-eluting stent. I gave her 1 month of just ticagrelor plus aspirin, and then I stopped her aspirin and just treated her with ticagrelor alone. So with that, I will actually conclude. I thank you for all of your time and attention, and I'm more than happy to take any questions if there may be any. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Beber. Very nice presentation, and then we get a lot of new new guidelines, from Dr. Beber, and then a lot of trials that there is toilet trials and so on. So now we come to Q&A sessions. But before we go to Q&A sessions, I would like to have important notice from committee, pemberitahuan untuk peserta, ya. bahwa e-sertifikat dapat diunduh di website Hopcardis, yaitu www.hopcardis.org, dan peserta diharapkan dapat berpartisipasi dalam mengisi form feedback yang ada di akhir sesi webinar. Materi berupa rekaman sesi webinar ini akan diunggah dan bisa diakses melalui website Hopcardis tadi, yang www.hopcardis.org. Tadi ada beberapa orang yang bertanya, adakah absensi? Jadi ini sudah otomatis terrecord di absensi di Zoom ini dan tidak perlu absen ya. Jadi langsung terrecord berapa lama dokter sekalian ikut dalam sesi ini. So we continue to Q&A sessions. First questions is from Dr. Bangun. Actually, this is a question for Dr. Yamin, but I think related also to Dr. Beber. Dr. Bangun said, I have patients who had his PCI 5 years ago and taking antiplatelet and anticoagulant over these years. And now he had head injury, maybe bleeding and so on. What do you suggest on making bleeding time normal? Maybe Dr. Yamin first.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think yang pertama adalah kita harus tahu kenapa pasien ini mendapat antikoagulan ya di samping antiplatelet. Mungkin ada atrial fibrillasi saya ya, atrial fibrillasi dengan high risk bleeding, high charge fast score itu antikoagulan, atau dia mechanical valve. Kalau enggak tentu kita tidak memberikan antikoagulan berkombinasi dengan antiplatelet. Biasanya kalau alasannya adalah pasien ini mendapatkan stent 5 tahun lalu, kalau kita boleh teliti bahwa antikoagulan aja cukup, single antikoagulan is sufficient ya kalau sudah lebih dari setahun, more than 1 year of PCI ya kan, kalau di RAF. Kalau dia mechanical valve juga demikian. Nah, kalau dia bleeding tentu kita lakukan penghentian ya kan, penghentian antikoagulan. Jadi bleedingnya itu kalau ada trauma cavitis kita hitung apa ringan, berat atau sedang. Kalau berat kita stop, tentu kita lakukan pemberian. Kalau ada antidotumnya, seandainya antikoagulannya adalah VKA, we can give vitamin K. Kalau dia dabigatran, kita bisa kasih dabigatran has the antidote now, dan kemudian kita berikan. Kalau nggak ada, tentu kita berikan produk-produk darah, FFP, transfusi segala macam ya. Jadi dihentikan antikoagulan, berikan antidotum kalau ada. Kalau antidotumnya tidak ada, misalnya antikoagulan yang belum punya antidotumnya, kita bisa berikan produk-produk darah yang umum untuk menghentikan antikoagulan seperti FFP, trombosit dan lain-lain. Itu jawaban dari saya, Dr. Eka.
Okay, maybe Dr. Beber will add the answer.
Yes, I think so. The question was about a patient who's on an anticoagulant and antiplatelet. So certainly for chronic secondary prevention, you really don't need to be on both an anticoagulant and an antiplatelet. So I think that's number one. The anticoagulant, particularly the newer direct oral anticoagulants, is sufficient. Secondly, if the patient has AFib, and that's the reason we have now other approaches to reduce stroke without anticoagulation, such as left atrial appendage occlusion. So that's another possibility to think about. But certainly when we have these issues and these patients have a bleeding event, we have to really treat that, address that. And if that means we have to stop the antithrombotic therapy, we have to do it. And you have to treat the acute issue, handle that, stabilize it. And then when you re-challenge the patient, it's important that I think you only expose them to one drug, not two.
Okay, thank you. So clear, be aware if you have to give antiplatelet and anticoagulant together. So we have to have a very clear reasons, yeah, for the indications. Second question, maybe for Dr. Beber. This is from anonymous attendee. We don't know from where. If we already use ticagrelor monotherapy for 1 year, what antiplatelet should be used if the patient is still in high ischemic risk? Maybe Dr. Beber first.
Yeah, so for this, to answer this question, and this is where several trials are now looking, we have, of course, the Pegasus trial that shows us after 1 year, you can administer ticagrelor at a reduced dose. So aspirin plus ticagrelor at a 60 milligram BID dose. And using that strategy, you will continue to lower subsequent risk for MI. So one strategy is continuing DAPT with aspirin and a reduced dose ticagrelor. It's something that I have done in my patients who've completed a year at 90 milligram twice a day. I then put them at 60 milligram twice a day. Now, the natural question is, do you really need aspirin? Could you just give ticagrelor 60 BID alone? I think you probably can, but we don't have any hard evidence to prove that. I'm sure somebody's either designing that study or is doing it now, but that is one approach. Is certainly continuing dual antiplatelet therapy, but you can use a reduced dose of ticagrelor for that.
Okay.
Dr. Eka,
Please.
Dr. Eka,
Yeah, Dr. Yamin.
related to this question, I would like to ask for Dr. Beber's comment.
Okay, yes, please.
The dose reduction in Asian actually. What I am aware of, one of the trial that you just presented about the dose reduction in Korea, and I read one trial with regard to Pasugrel dose reduction in Japan, because they conducted their own trial, and it turned out that the 30 or 20 milligram loading dose is sufficient for Japanese, and with a lot of lower dose for maintenance. So what is the justification of dose reduction across the ethnicity, Dr. Beber?
Yeah, so I think the dose reduction, there's been a trial, yes, looking at prasugrel dose reduction compared to standard dose, and clearly that was better. The Optima trial that I mentioned showed you get adequate platelet inhibition. So I think and we don't have firm, I think, guidance or guidelines to necessarily tell us that, but I imagine we will in the not too distant future, that may suggest in East Asian patients, we could consider really starting off at a lower dose. I think not all, but maybe the majority, you could even start off at a lower dose. Of course, what we need are just larger studies. The TICA Korea study, the PHILO study, even the TALOS AMI studies, all of these studies, but each one of these studies doesn't have all that many patients and all that many events. And the big question is, are we paying a penalty on the thrombotic side? It doesn't look like we are. And I think dose reduction to me will be a very good strategy in the East Asian population.
Thank you.
Any others, Dr. Yamin?
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, thank you. So we move to another question from Dr. Biri Karim. Assalamualaikum, Dr. Usman Beber and Dr. Yamin. I would like to address two questions for you from Dr. Biri Karim. Nowadays is short DAPT drug-eluting stent era. Some studies comment 1 until 3 months short DAPT duration for HBR patients. How about those HBR patients who undergo complex PCI like complex bifurcations or CTO or left main? Are those patients still require short DAPT or better extend DAPT longer until 12 months to prevent restenosis? Dr. Beber, first.
Yeah, so I think this is a great question, and it requires us to recognize that even though we have the high bleeding risk criteria, even in that group of patients, we have variations in thrombotic and bleeding risk. So the high bleeding risk patient who has underlying diabetes, presents with a troponin positive syndrome, has a very complex PCI, multiple stents, in my opinion, that patient still has enough thrombotic risk where one could justify a longer duration of DAPT, even ticagrelor and maybe withdrawing aspirin, some of the strategies we just talked about. However, the high bleeding risk patient who has an oral anticoagulant, age 85 plus, platelet count less than 100, those kind of patients, and they don't have the other risk factors, I would be very concerned about doing any more than a few, 4 or more weeks of dual antiplatelet therapy. And I think that's what the trade-off model showed us by Dr. Urban and colleagues. So I think really what you have to do is identify in your HBR patient, do they have other parameters that really accentuate their thrombotic risk? And if they do, I think you have to give them a little bit more aggressive. For the other ones, I would be reluctant and I would treat them with just a few weeks of DAPT.
Okay. Dr. Yamin?
Yes, I
Any
do.
comment?
Yeah, I do agree with Dr. Beber comments. I would like to address that. Actually, the bleeding risk and the ischemic risk are dynamic risks. So we have procedural, intraprocedural risk factors, and then patient factors, and also co-medication factors. What the company and the current society is trying to do is to modify the intraprocedural risk, like stent design, thinner strut, and now some stents are coming out with very very thin strut and with very good profile that enable us to give a shorter DAPT. But we have to remind also that the bleeding risk is sometimes also modifiable in some instance, like kidney function, alcohol intake, liver dysfunction. Sometimes we can treat that risk or improve that risk that can bring the patient to the lower risk. So I think all these factors are dynamic. So the procedural risk is also should be modified. The patient factors, the bleeding risk factor can be modified. So as long as we can control and modify some factors, I think if we consider that the procedure is so complex with long stents and very complex lesion, it is justified to extend the APT as long as we can modify some of the bleeding risk factors. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yamin. So we can move to next question, also from Dr. Biri Karim. He asked, do you have data similar to Twilight ACS study that we can apply to peripheral intervention regarding short DAPT? Yeah, please, Dr. Beber.
Yeah, I wish we did. The answer is no. We did have some patients with PAD, and I think you highlight a great point. The PAD patients are another group that is at very high risk for thrombotic events and are very much undertreated. The strategy that seems to be evolving in these patients, though, is a low dose of an anticoagulant. For example, adding low-dose rivaroxaban on top of aspirin. That was studied in the Voyager PAD trial that seemed to be of benefit. So right now, no, we don't have similar data for that, but that's another group of patients where I think being more aggressive will be very beneficial.
Okay, Dr. Yamin, any comment for this question?
I think that's sufficient already.
All right. So we hope in the future there is extension from the study. All right. So next question from Dr. Simon Salim. This is our EP expert, Dr. Beber. Dear professors, in the recent trends for short-term DAPT and then single antiplatelet afterwards for patients without atrial fibrillation, would it be appropriate or ethical for us to devise a trial to compare DOAC, DOAC versus single antiplatelet after short term, maybe after 1 month, or the APT? Is there any caveat why we should stick to long-term single antiplatelet rather than long-term DOAC? Maybe Dr. Yamin first about atrial fibrillation.
Yeah, I think, of course, for atrial fibrillation patient undergoing PCI or those who have concomitant coronary artery disease, I think very clear guideline already published by EHRA, European Heart Rhythm Society, that we also consider bleeding risk of this patient. So most of the time, I think triple therapy is not recommended. So aspirin should be as short as possible. I think, if not mistaken, 1 week, less than 1 week should be stopped and then continue with double therapy for 1 month if the patient very high risk bleeding, for 3 months for high risk bleeding, and very high bleeding, for low risk bleeding, we can continue the double therapy to 6 months or 12 months, and after 12 months, single oral anticoagulant alone. I'm not comparing the antiplatelet, the anticoagulant in this setting. I think because the pathomechanism of the disease itself are different. So I'm not aware that whether, because in coronary artery disease, I think the platelet-driven thrombosis is more prominent rather than the fibrin-driven thrombosis. So that's why I think it is not comparable to do the trial with different single oral anticoagulant or single antiplatelet alone. What's your comment, Dr. Beber? This
Mr.
very
Weber, please, your comment.
question.
Yes, no, it's a great question, and I agree with you, Dr. Yamin. This brings up the issue for the chronic patient, right? What's the best strategy? And I think there are two evolving strategies. One strategy is the low dose anticoagulant. For example, that was seen in the COMPASS trial, 2.5 rivaroxaban. We saw Voyager PAD, and it seems that if we can identify the patients who are at high risk for stroke, the low-dose anticoagulant seems to be the better strategy. In the COMPASS trial, there was an almost 40% reduction in stroke that led to a mortality benefit. Now, in contrast, for antiplatelet, I think the greatest benefit comes on the coronary side. And certainly there are more coronary events every year than stroke events. I think the challenge we have is it's hard for us to accurately identify the patient who will have a stroke in the future compared with an MI. If we could do that, then I think you could tailor the strategy. So I think it could be done, a study like that in long-term secondary prevention. That's how the COMPASS trial was done, the Pegasus trial, other studies, and I think that's what's sort of evolving in the literature.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Simon, I think the answer is clear, for atrial fibrillation patient. So we continue to the last question, Dr. Weber. I think this is the final question because the question is very simple, but the answer is tricky. Which strategy do you prefer to reduce bleeding risk? Monotherapy with potent P2Y12 inhibitor or the escalation to clopidogrel? Okay, Dr. Weber, please.
So my personal bias is certainly for withdrawal of aspirin. I think the data are very clear that is the superior strategy when you look at the data. Having said that, de-escalation is a very practical strategy when you're dealing with issues of cost or access or things like that. The concern I have with at least de-escalation to clopidogrel, de-escalation to reduced dose ticagrelor or prasugrel is not unreasonable, but to clopidogrel is the issue of clopidogrel non-response. And you only need one patient who has a stent thrombosis because they're a non-responder to really change your practice. So if I am going to de-escalate, I would like to know that the patient is a responder using their genotype or some other means. And that makes things a little bit more complicated to do it as a routine. So my bias would be, I think, aspirin withdrawal, I think, has the best data. It's easy to do. It's understandable. De-escalation is reasonable, but I would caution that we should do it when you know someone is a responder, and then you de-escalate.
Okay, Dr. Yamin.
Yeah, I think I
comment, please.
Dr. Weber, especially in Asian population, we have the data that the polymorphisms in Asian is quite higher compared to the Western population. So I think if we would like to de-escalate the patient to clopidogrel from ticagrelor, it is strongly recommended to have a genotype test for platelet reactivity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So that is our last questions, and then we have to close because of time. We have to close this very good sessions. But before we close, I want us to Dr. Weber and Dr. Yamin to give 1 minute final or closing statement. Please, Dr. Weber, please.
Yes, so I think the lessons from this session is that thinking about bleeding and ischemic risk is an evolving framework. I think we've learned that bleeding, not just fatal bleeding, but non-fatal bleeding matters. And I think the biggest takeaway is that when you see your patient, really think about what is their bleeding risk, what is their ischemic risk, and develop a strategy up front of what you might want to do if they indeed are someone who might be a candidate for, let's say, withdrawing aspirin, de-escalation, or short DAP. This will require us to think about these strategies up front. And there is much more evidence to come. Many more trials are being designed. So this is an area that's going to continue to evolve, both for acute patients and for chronic patients.
Thank you, Dr. Weber. Very clear. Dr. Yamin, please, your closing statement.
I think when we are facing patients who are needing double antiplatelet, we have to consider that this patient is our family, our own mother, our own father. Put ourselves into the patient's shoes. so that we can be very aware and very careful in managing the double antiplatelet for this patient. So especially for those who do the procedures, sometimes they're just more concentrated on the device, the stent types, than they are forgetting or sometimes do not take a lot of attention into the other cofactors that may take the patient into the high bleeding risk or ischemic event. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yamin. Thank you, Dr. Beber. Thank you, Dr. Yamin. We have a very nice session today, and then thank you special for Dr. Beber. They have and Dr. Yamin as well, because their time, your times, and then your knowledge, giving to us. So before I close this sessions, there is some pemberitahuan, e-sertifikat bisa diunduh sekali lagi di www.hopcardis.org, bisa unduh di situ, dan tolong diisi form feedbacknya. Dan selanjutnya pada hari ini akan ada webinar berikutnya yang akan dimulai jam 10 sampai jam 11.30, yaitu webinar tentang Imaging in Calcium Coronary Lesions yang akan dimoderatori oleh guru kita, Profesor Dr. Hanafi B. Trisnohadi, spesialis penyakit dalam konsultan kardiovaskuler SPJP, dan akan mendatangkan dua pembicara, yaitu yang pertama Dr. Todung DA Silalahi, SPP DKKV, Finasim Vika, Fapsik, FACC, FSCI, yang akan membawakan tentang IFUS as imaging modalities. Dan berikutnya adalah Dr. Yamin, Dr. Yamin, SPJP konsultan FACC, FSCA, akan membacakan materi tentang treatment in calcified coronary lesions. Dan akhirnya kita sampai pada acara kita kali ini, pada akhir acara kita. Semoga bermanfaat sekali ilmunya, dan kami ucapkan terima kasih terutama kepada seluruh peserta webinar yang sudah menyimak. Semoga ilmunya yang didapat bermanfaat dan dapat diaplikasikan sejawat sekalian. Dan tentu kami ucapkan terima kasih kepada sponsor kami hari ini hingga acara ini bisa berlangsung, yaitu dari AstraZeneca. Dan tentunya kepada pembicara kita kali ini, Dr. Beber dan Dr. Yamin, I would like to thanks from committee and thanks for your time. Terima kasih atas update ilmunya yang telah diberikan. Dan mengingatkan kembali pada sesi webinar lain dengan topik dan pembicaraan yang berbeda yang tentu akan sangat menarik pada Hopcardis di 2021 ini. Saya ucapkan akhir kalam, terima kasih semua. Thank you to all, and I close this session. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good morning.
Salam. Thank you, Dr. Beber. See you.
Terima kasih.
Waalaikumsalam. Thank you.
Thank you.
One day we'll invite you to Indonesia.